me chairing today because Kerry's unable to attend, so be gentle with me, okay? Do you want me to make introductions first as councillors? I'll go to Rebecca Fogarty first.
Hi, Rebecca Fogarty, councillor for West Cross.
Les. Hand.
I've got Leslie Walton, councillor for Gower. Gorse, Cockett, Downhill. Oh, I don't know, one of them. Looking at
Alan Jeffrey, yes, Uplands councillor.
Hello, Angela O'Connor, one of the councillors from Mumbles.
Any councillors online? Sorry. Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself, Hannah?
Hi, Hannah Lawson, Castle Ward.
Okay. Louise?
Hi, I'm Louise Gibbard, councillor for Dunvant Ward, cabinet member for care services. So just observing, and I can join in if you need me.
Yvonne?
Yvonne Jardine, councillor for Morriston.
Okay, thank you. We move on. We move on. Amy, do you want to introduce?
Amy Hawkins, Head of Tackling Poverty and Adult Services.
Dave Howes, Director of Social Services.
G. Richards, Tackling Poverty Strategy Development Manager.
Alison Lowe, Democratic Services Officer.
Lucy from Legal.
Good afternoon, Lucy Moore from Childcare Legal.
Lee, is it? Okay, Lee.
Hello, Lee Cambouli, Tackling Poverty Principal Officer.
Okay.
Julie's just come in.
Oh, sorry, Julie.
Is that me? Julia Manser. I'm a visitor here and from SCVS and West Glamorgan Regional Partnership.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Julie Davis, Head of Child and Family Services.
Thank you.
Hayley's joined us.
Yeah, and I can see Hayley's just joined us online as well. So introduce yourself, Hayley.
Hayley Gwilym, Cabinet Member for Community Support Services.
Thank you. I think I've covered everybody, yeah? Okay.
Simon.
Oh, Simon. Simon, are you there?
Yeah, Simon Jones, Social Services.
Okay, we move on to the agenda then, and the first item is going to be apologies for absence.
Apologies from the chair, Kerry Evans. He's not able to make it today.
Thank you. Second is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests. Anna?
I'm an employee of SCVS.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. We move on to the minutes then, and that's to approve and sign the minutes of the previous meeting as a correct record, and that's on pages 1 and 2. If somebody accept them, please. Yeah.
I accept them.
Annie Bond, second. All in agreement? Thank you. The next is to introduce the workforce programme, and I'm going to hand over to Dave Howes. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Chair. I'm hoping we can put a presentation up on the screen. Just wait a couple of minutes. Just by way of introduction, I suppose to get the committee's deliberations going, the presentation is going to take us through some of the actions that we have been taking in connection really with strategies from Welsh Government and others around trying to keep the our workforce and our care and support services going during the pandemic, and then you know, in more recent months as well. So pretty much it's a reflection on what's happening now to kick off the deliberations that the committee might want to have about things that you might want to work with us on taking forward, going forwards. And I'll set out some of those challenges at the end of the presentation. But first of all, I'll take us through what we have been up to. So we'll go to the first slide. The only challenge with this is that I can't read all the way over there, so I'll have to look round. So broadly speaking, things I'm going to cover are some of the cross-directorate things that have been effectively our implementation of, thank you, our implementation of Welsh government specific initiatives, talk about some of our cross-directorate work, and then some of the specific deliverables for both child and family services and adult services and tackling poverty. Next slide. So if we skipped, actually it's not on here. Hang on, I'll cover that anyway. Oh, sorry, it's double-sided. Apologies. So first of all, the policy context in which we have been and are continuing to work, and will be part of the deliberations of the committee. So Welsh Government have been very clear about their rebalancing agenda, and effectively what they're talking about is wanting to move from so much of direct care and support services being delivered effectively through the independent market to bring more of that into both direct delivery by local government, often working with health services, but also around a focus on expanding not-for-profit type service provision as well. So that's an overall policy context that we have to pay attention to. And in particular, we reference a healthier Wales and the workforce strategy for health and social care. And I suppose that's one of the challenges for the committee as to how much the deliberations will be about, or how are we joining in with that broader direction of travel from Welsh Government, and how much of it's within the gift of the local authority to to take care of itself. And I suspect it will be a balance of the two, but we definitely need to pay attention and be mindful of that Welsh Government position and how they want health and care to be moved forward. Sorry, next slide. So just a couple of the specific Welsh Government initiatives that have been implemented predominantly during the COVID period. So there were a number of schemes, significant financial investment schemes targeting effectively recognition payments and extra payments for social care staff. So I'm not going to go into detail. You would have heard about those schemes when they were when they were implemented, but they were sizable. I definitely think they were well received by the not just council workforce, but that wider social care workforce across the piece. They were a response to the challenges we had at that time, as opposed to necessarily being part of a longer term solution of how do you make sure you've got a resilient and fit for purpose workforce. And the reality is, despite those significant financial interventions, what we've seen over the period is a diminution in the amount of health and care staff across the piece. And it wouldn't matter which sector of the workforce you looked at, you will see that diminution pretty much, as I say, across the piece. And there are particular areas where that gives us particular concern. But again, I'll touch on some of those at the end of the presentation. Next slide. At the same time as some of these effectively one-off payments, what Welsh Government also responded to was trying to strike the right balance between, certainly during the period of the COVID pandemic, and despite those workforce challenges, what we couldn't have effectively was staff that were ill, and particularly staff that were ill with COVID, feeling that they needed to be in work because they couldn't afford not to be in work. So there were changes to statutory sick pay arrangements, which to the credit of the council, whilst Welsh Government made the money available, it was down to the council to change things to deliver that. Not just for our own workforce, but for that significant workforce that sits out of outside the council. So just want to credit and honour that work and the responsibility of the council in terms of delivering that. Next slide. One of the things that's been very necessary always, but certainly during this period of COVID, we had huge amounts of, I suppose, coming and going of the workforce being available or not, either because of us trying to attract people into the workforce numbers of people choosing, voting with their feet and deciding that, frankly, there was easier work elsewhere. And then obviously just managing isolation, high levels of sickness absence. We had a period where nobody was taking any leave, and then we've had periods where we've tried to make sure people, all of that churn, I guess, of the workforce been incredibly difficult to manage and make sure we support their well-being, but also keep services going whilst also all of that was going on. So again, one of the things that that we have strengthened is our monitoring and oversight of all of that, I suppose. And whilst you can see that as boring back office stuff, it's incredibly important and needs to be maintained going forward. But clearly we need an infrastructure capable and able to do that as well. Next slide. In line with that, one of the particular we've always had a challenge around keeping our workforce, not just us, but again those providers working in the independent sector, keeping them safe and well and able to be in work. That's always been a challenge for us in a challenging, stressful work environment. But frankly, people aren't paid particularly well. That was all exacerbated during COVID. So we've had particular focus on, I guess, building our infrastructure to be able to make sure we're focusing on that where people are becoming unwell, that we're responsive to that and trying to get them better and back in work. And I'll touch later on around some of the psychological well-being stuff that that's been put in place as well. And we had a particular pilot around domiciliary care and our in-house domiciliary care services, where we created some extra resource to support managers who were extremely busy just keeping things going, to relieve some of that workforce management stuff, which is just expected to be a part of somebody's day job, and creating some bespoke resource to focus particularly on that. That was successful. That did make a difference in terms of the numbers of staff we were able to keep safe and well in work. So we both expanded that within our directorate to other areas, and then other bits of the council looked at that and said, well, that appears to have worked well, we're going to have some of that as well. So that's a good improvement in terms of some of the infrastructure support again we've put around the workforce. Next slide. And I'll get into some of the detail around specific initiatives we've done. First of all, around staff development. So we've done considerable work around revising our approach to supporting staff through supervision and appraisal. We've always had arrangements in place for supervision and appraisal, but we strengthened them. Looked again at whatever that might be, the conduct of the meetings, the associated paperwork, etc. And we created that, to some extent, deviated a bit from the corporate expectations around that, where there was an idea that we could all have one approach to some of this work, and that the systems that we use for that could all be aligned. The reality was you do need something bespoke for these very personalised care and support type services where staff focus there. So we've made some changes, and again we'll be feeding that into council developments going forward. We've tried to, particularly important during periods of time where everyone was away from work, isolated in your own bubble, having to work, that doesn't work well for us again as a human people type service. So we've tried to have a focus on maintaining some opportunity to get staff together and work with them. That was more difficult at different periods of the pandemic, but particularly as into this year, we've had more of a focus on that team development, and also an aspiration to get staff back into the office safely, working with teams and colleagues. Not all of the time, it's still a hybrid arrangement, but certainly our emphasis on spending more time with one another, more time with your teams, getting that peer and emotional support. We have had a focus on making sure we have a cross-directorate training and development plan that looks forward over the next few years. As part of something you take for granted to have if you're going to develop your workforce, but nevertheless you need to put the effort into making sure that you've got it. So we've been working on that. particular emphasis again, not just for us, but for staff across the council. We facilitated all the work on improving our corporate safeguarding training, and then the associated bespoke safeguarding training for our staff that obviously need something more than the rest of the council, and including with that a recognition that not all of our staff, certainly across the council, but also within the directorate, don't necessarily have access to IT. So obvious e-learning opportunities, you need to create other face-to-face opportunities as well. That's all been taken forward. One of the areas that I'll touch on at the end around a particular challenge for us is the struggle to have enough qualified social workers. That's a national challenge, but that's playing out for us locally. So we've invested in our approach to supporting more of our existing staff to take up seeking qualifications through the OU route. Again, we've had that available in past years. What we've done is up to the number of people that we would support and the amount of financial investment. That's not a quick win for us. That's an investment in growing our own effectively over the next couple of years. But nevertheless, we've made a start on that. Again, one of our significant challenges is around the challenge we have about not having particularly enough experienced social workers. So in your strategy to grow your own, you need to have a strategy also around how you're supporting the newly qualified social workforce. So we have a bespoke approach to being able to support those staff to hopefully grow them into being confident and experienced staff over a number of years, prepared to stay with us. Again, that is a challenge when you've got a dearth of social work capacity, being able to protect newly qualified staff and make sure we invest in mentoring and supporting them properly. That's a constant challenge for us, probably particularly so in children's services. So the basic arrangements are in place, but being able to deliver those arrangements properly for our staff continues to be a challenge. One of the ways we grow our own is to be an organisation that supports students training, through other university courses, etc., to come and undertake practice placements with us, and then, but particularly for third-year students, for them then to be attracted to taking up opportunities and staying with us. So at the same time as doing all of that, and at the same time as all the burdens on our existing staff, we're encouraging and supporting them to be competent practice assessors who can support social workers to undertake placements with us. So it's one of the pipelines for us. Again, I'll touch upon it a bit more further on. But in the absence of having sufficient qualified social workers, we've been looking to develop what we're describing as differently qualified staff who may well be attracted then to taking on the social work qualification, taking up those OU opportunities, etc. But we also need to support those staff who are differently qualified, might come from different backgrounds, education, police, whatever it might be, to be competent in their role as a differently qualified member of staff. So again, those training and development opportunities are in place. And then associated with that would be the various vocational qualifications, etc., all of which we are supporting and progressing as best we can. Next slide. To support some of that work, again, we've invested in some additional capacity around within our own directorates to support all of the recruitment activity that's associated with what I've just described, and also provided some additional funding to the corporate centre to support them to particularly prioritise, I guess, the recruitment of staff in our area. So whilst we still follow all of the corporate processes of recruitment, but we've invested in additional resource to try and prioritise that for obvious reasons. If our care services are falling over, detrimental impact on our population is so great that the council can't really afford for that to happen. So we're doing what we can to mitigate that with additional resource, but it remains a huge challenge, is the truth of it. Next slide. I've touched upon some of this already. So some of the things in terms of recruitment and retention around child and family services in particular. So we've increased the number of support worker roles. We've also invested additionally in business support roles. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because one of the areas we often go to as big organisations when we say we're struggling, we don't have enough money, we can't do everything, is let's cut some of the back office. And that sounds attractive and simple. The reality is that would be extremely self-defeating for us. What we've actually found as beneficial is if you can find ways of invested in targeted business support, relieving some of the burdens from frontline staff wherever possible, you can actually help build additional resilience in frontline staff. So that's the approach that we have been taking to date. How long we can continue to manage to do that, it's very sensible logically, but you know, we'll see whether that becomes a challenge for the council going forward. Again, another thing that's we've been around this circle historically. Any of you that have been in aware of what's went on in children's services 10 years ago when we were really struggling with workforce then, one of the things we introduced at that point was market supplements for some of the roles where we're struggling most to recruit and retain staff. We managed to move away from that for a number of years. We've gone back to a point where we've implemented that again. I think it's well recognised that whilst that's a sensible and logical measure in extremis, it's never part of a long-term solution, but it is in place at the moment, at least for some of our teams. But difficult to sustain, and we wouldn't necessarily choose to sustain it because it has lots of unintended consequences for how you run your services otherwise. One of the things that I think is a good thing is that and I'm assuming will be permanent change for us is we'd introduced historically as part of job evaluation a newly qualified grade for social workers, which made sense at the time. It no longer made sense, and we were completely out of kilter with other local authorities in Wales. So we've changed that, and my assumption is, subject to some further work, that will be a permanent change, and will make it make us a more obviously attractive local authority to be work for those newly qualified staff. A more innovative development, which is in the early stages of being put in place, is the creation of a social work academy, which captures lots of the things that I've already talked about, but predominantly is a means by which we can develop new staff coming to join us, where they will have things like protected caseload. They won't necessarily be drawn into working with the most complex family situations that we're working with. They'll be allocated with particular support in a particular bit of the directorate. I think that is, you know, proper innovation. Lots of the stuff that I've talked about up until now isn't necessarily particularly innovative. I think that is innovative, but it's at the early stages, so we want to see how we can grow and develop that approach across the directorate. Talked already about our focus on differently qualified staff. One of the things that's very pleasing is that some of the targeted recruitment activity that's been in place, working with other teams across our directorate, employability services, etc., is we've had lots of targeted recruitment work, which has been very successful for those differently qualified staff, those support worker type staff. So clearly this area of work is attractive to, you know, a workforce that's out there. It isn't necessarily our traditionally registered workforce, but there is another workforce who are, or a part of the workforce that is interested in working with children and families in particular. So we're taking advantage of that at the moment. Next slide. Then just a few comments on some of the specific deliverables around adult services and wider tackling poverty, bit of the directorate. So psychological first aid that I referenced earlier on. So one of the things we're very cognizant of, particularly during COVID, was that impact on our workforce of the really difficult circumstances in which our direct care staff and others were working. So we put in place arrangements where you could get additional psychological support. And that, most obvious example of that would be, for not just our care homes, but care homes in the independent sector. Early on during the pandemic, the amount of individuals that tragically died, and of course our staff were working working alongside those individuals, having to support their families, etc., in the most dreadful, terrible circumstances. So clearly putting in place additional mental health support for those staff, very necessary. That has been maintained. It is, any suggestion that that we're over the pandemic and things, that is not the health and care world. If anything, our staff are still probably even more challenged than they ever were. So those types of supports need to continue to be in place. Next slide. Around recruitment and retention in adult services, it's challenged. It's a different picture to the particular areas of children's services. Nevertheless, health and care staff, social workers, and particularly domiciliary care staff, we've got a real deficit there. One of the things we are working on is what would be a fit for purpose structure for our services going forward, and part of that is a remodelling of the workforce that you would need to support that optimal structure. That's work in progress. It's been long held ambition in Swansea to have full coverage across the area of local area coordinators as part of our shift to a more preventative asset and strengths based approach to working with and in communities. I'm pleased to say that we have recruited local area coordination across across the piece now, which is great. It needs to now become part of a wider approach to, as I say, working with and in communities, rather than just being dominated by what's our statutory offer. Again, that'll be a challenge to get that right balance as to what the council can and can't invest in going forward. We've had to do lots of work around what we described as an additional support team. That effectively was a reflection of during particular periods during the pandemic, there was a real risk that health and care services would fall over altogether. So care homes collapse, or domiciliary care providers really struggling to maintain any type of a service offer. So we tried to create within the council, and are preparing to do so again this coming winter, where we think it will be really difficult again, scope to be able to mobilise staff to go wherever the pressures are. That might be our internal care homes, that might be care homes in the independent market, etc. If we can, we would try and expand that to care for people at home as well. But that is a real that's a real challenge for us. So that work was successful up until now. We'll see whether we can create it and maintain it during this coming winter as well. We've also looked at our expectations of particularly our internal domiciliary care staff expectations. They were fantastic, as you all know, during the pandemic. They continue to work in extremely challenging circumstances, but it's clear to us now that if we're going to progress that service offer going forward, that requires some changes of approach as well, and it's proper and reasonable that should be recognised in their job description, and they should receive proper pay, etc. as a result. Effectively, what that will lead to is bringing our domiciliary care staff in line with other types of care, direct care staff across the council. So I think that's a real positive. That's in the process of being worked on at the moment. And then I'm hoping I'm getting near the end of this. 2 more slides. So just in terms of specific work around recruitment, I won't go through all of these, but you can see from the slides that the obvious things that you would expect to have if you were focusing particularly on being the best possible recruiter, we've invested in those things. So upped our presence on radio campaigns. Particularly impactful has been the thing that I referenced earlier around working with employability services around pop-up employability. What do we call it? A shop?
Yeah,
Pop-up shop in Quadrant. That's worked really well, where we've had targeted activity via that. That's some good success. So we'll keep progressing that. Does mean, as is referenced on the slide, that you have to be really slick then with your interviewing process. So if you do all of that work and then you get interest, you have to be ready as a council to respond to that interest. We've worked hard to do what we can within the directorate. There are some corporate challenges around how our corporate systems work. So we're working hard with corporate colleagues to try and make that a bit slicker. And then final slide. Again, just some other examples of bespoke bits of partnership working. Some of them are obvious, working with health colleagues around our integrated services and making sure that we don't trip each other up with our recruitment activity. Lots of stuff around careers, going out to schools, going out to the universities, etc. And I'll probably reference a particular one, that working with the African community. That was a particular regional initiative where we thought some work, particularly with that community, who wouldn't necessarily have probably experienced us as an employer or a sector, that would be warm and welcoming of them. So we did lots of work around, making that clear that we are, and some specific work around reducing the barriers, I guess, to recruitment for that particular community. And again, our experience of that's been very successful. So I want to see us do more of that, particularly as we are such, we have such diverse community in Swansea. That looks like a real opportunity. That's the end of the presentation, Chair. Went on a bit longer than I thought, but I hope it set the scene. I suppose one of the challenges for the committee is, well, in the context of all of that stuff, plus there is national work that's being taken forward, that necessarily national work, and I'll give an example of that. There is work ongoing at the moment around should terms and conditions for social workers, should they be standardised across Wales instead of having different terms and conditions in all sorts of different local authorities, which to some extent encourages, particularly on the M4 corridor, quite a lot of movement between different local authorities. Who's paying more at the moment? What sort of roles have they got? So some standardisation of that. You couldn't do that except on a national basis. So it's not within the gift of the local authority to take forward that initiative. There's also a big piece of work around a progression framework for social care staff. That particularly we're thinking about how do we stabilise the massive deficit across the piece around domiciliary care. Again, it's not really within the gift of the council to overcome some of those systemic barriers without us working with Welsh Government and all other local authorities. So that's some of the work that's going on. It would be sensible for the committee to be cited on that work, but we're not quite sure when that work's going to progress. So it's difficult for you to timetable it into your agenda. So that's one of the challenges for you, I think. I guess I was thinking a bit about it. If I was going to pick the two big areas that you might want to consider doing more work on, one of them I suppose I broadly describe as, yes, okay, there are things that could be taken forward, may well make a difference over the next couple of years, but how do we survive in the meantime? What are the things that we're going to do on top of all of the things that I've already described as are ongoing? What could we do? And in particular, are there any changes to policy, etc., that we might need to make as a council to just bias that breathing space for some of this national work to progress and either work or not work. You know, so that's one of the areas, because despite all that I've described, the reality is, as things stand today, we don't have enough social worker capacity within particularly children's services across the piece, but particularly children's services, and we don't have enough direct care staff to deliver, again, you know, the care and support that our population need. There is a massive deficit. It's very evident in domiciliary care, but it's also evident in the instability that there is around either having enough staff to manage our internal care homes. It's even more prevalent in the external market, where I've described again, we will face pressures this winter where some of that care provision could well fall over. One of the factors around that will be an insufficient workforce in some of those homes. So one of the areas that you might want to look at is, what could we do? You know, what should we do on top of everything I've described to try and maintain some stability and resilience as best we can? And then I suppose the other area, which is a bit more forward thinking and a bit more in keeping with what I would expect a committee to look at, is around that rebalancing agenda, that policy initiative from Welsh Government, which I support and I understand the logic of it. How would we contribute and implement that safely without undermining current service provision? You know, so how much, and in a financially sustainable way. So how would we, as a council, grow our proportion of care and support that we deliver directly ourselves or through working with the not-for-profit sector? And that's a slightly different picture for adult services and children's services. So they're the two big meaty issues. Quite how the committee does that work, I'm open to suggestions, but they seem like the areas that are perhaps in keeping with what the committee might have been thinking of when it picked this as an area of interest. And I've taken up too much time in the committee, so I'll stop there, Chair.
Okay, before I ask for any questions, can I just congratulate you on all the work that's been done? I think we've been through the most traumatic period that I've ever known in my lifetime, so I can only commend you on the work that's been done so far. And I know we're facing really difficult situations, especially, I think it's in every part of trade or community, whatever you're working in, it's difficulty recruiting everybody. So hands up to you all, and congratulations on what you're doing. But I want to open it up to questions. Anybody got anything? Rebecca?
Thanks for a very comprehensive presentation. I just wanted to ask what the potential opportunities are around apprenticeships, whether there are any already in the council or whether that could be something that could be explored.
Yeah, thank you. And we should have touched on it in the report. Yes, we do try and encourage and create those apprenticeship opportunities. I suspect we could do more. So one of our ambitions should be, well, let's make sure in every area of our service there is definitely an apprentice opportunity as well. So I think a point well made. It exists. My view would be probably not enough though, so it should be part of the strategy.
Angela?
Yeah, again, thank you for all the work that you're doing. It's, tough times. Just touching on what you said about the training schemes and stuff, I'm just wondering if there's anything with fast tracking people into the force and kind of, I suppose, grading the people that are already fully qualified up and introducing sort of a new grade, if you like, for those coming in as a sort of an incentive. I don't know whether I'm wording it quite right. I mean, that probably is a change to policy, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm absolutely understanding what you're describing, but I think elements of what you're describing is part of what's in the descriptions of what we've talked about. But I think you're right. Every opportunity that there is to give somebody the opportunity to come and work with us and then develop their skills and abilities, and quite how quite what implications that might have for our current grading structure, etc. And any changes then have to be legal and not fall foul of job evaluation, all of that kind of stuff. But I think it's an area that we could look at. Do we need to do something different? And if it becomes a required policy change in order to implement that, well, that's the business of this committee then, isn't it, to recommend policy changes? So an area that we can look at further.
You. I got Councillor Jardine first. Leslie, bring you in then. Councillor Jardine.
Thanks very much, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions, and thanks for the presentation. But I was just wondering, you mentioned mentoring and support for new staff. Do we still provide that for, staff who are more permanent staff that's been with us a while? I know there's the helping hands, but do we have, besides appraisal, a mentoring and support for staff?
Yeah, so all of our staff, probably a bit different to the rest of the council, all of our staff need to have effectively an element of clinical supervision on a regular basis. And part of that clinical supervision picks up on that that mentoring. Outside of that, part of the reason I'm talking about encouraging or wanting to encourage staff to come back and spend time in the office with their teams is over the years we've been very reliant on that peer support and that opportunity for informal discussions in the office with your team, with your supervisor, with your manager, etc., which has been impacted by COVID, and one of the ways of overcoming it is to encourage staff and then provide the space for them to work in their teams, etc. So it does exist. It's always been a necessary part of our business, Councillor Jardine. It was probably impacted as a result of the extremity of asking everybody to work at home. So we're in the process of rebuilding that resilience. But yes, whilst I might talk about specific initiatives around mentoring and support for new staff, etc., because that's absolutely crucial, it still exists in one guise or another for all staff.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I've got one more question, Chair, if that's okay.
No problem, go on, Yvonne.
About 10 years ago, when we were in a sort of similar situation, we had social workers from overseas. Are we thinking of doing anything like that, or are we not that short-staffed at the moment?
No, I think we do have to look at that. We had a couple of stabs at it, but I don't know how well you remember it, Councillor Jardine. We had a couple of stabs at it. The first time we ever tried that, we didn't get it right. We lost staff almost straight away. We didn't have the support mechanisms in place. We didn't have the experience of trying to implement something like that. So staff came and then staff left. The second time we did it, we did learn lessons from that first occasion, and we kept staff for a long period of time. That required considerable levels of support. The landscape's changed a bit with clearly with Brexit and some of the changes that there've been around the rules around it, but it's definitely has to be on the table. One of the suggestions, again from Welsh Government, has been or allegedly the system and approaches that are in place in the health service are much more mature than local governments, and that so the idea is that we might piggyback some of that for some cohorts of the workforce, and particularly the direct care workforce that are working. It's not so clear, is it social care, is it health, etc. So certainly some of that workforce that we rely upon in our integrated models of care. I think perhaps for social workers, it'll be, if we do something, it will be more similar to what you remember from previously, Councillor Jardine, and we'll have to dust off some of that work to make sure we don't make the mistakes that we did first time round, and make sure if that is an opportunity that it's a bit, you know, more like what was successful second time. But the other consideration may well be that we don't necessarily on this occasion do it on our own, that it becomes a wider local government initiative, and we perhaps do that in collaboration with some other local authorities. But I definitely think it's part of, you know, part of the potential strategy going forward.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Jenny. Councillor Walton.
Thanks, Chair. Not really a question, but a quite positive comment. I'm very pleased that so much of this document is on retention and how much we need to look after staff, and how much preferable it is to retaining staff rather than recruiting. And as you say, we've got a pretty big gap anyway, that so it makes, for me, it makes it even more important. So I'm very pleased to see how much has been done to try and keep staff, and particularly on what Councillor Jardine mentioned, the sort of mental health support that staff, all staff need. I mean, not just in this area, but this is probably one of the most important areas to give really strong mental health support, particularly because of what they must have had to go through with COVID. I mean, I can't even imagine what some of the staff, the situations they were in. Some of the situations in their work must be difficult enough, but if you've also got things in your family that you've got issues there, the fact that somebody might have died, you couldn't go to their funeral, all these sort of things. So my thanks again to endorse what the chair said. My thanks to all the staff and for keeping going. Good on them. Thank you.
Are there any more questions, please? And thank you indeed for your presentation, and just hope things are going to get better and better and better. Okay, thank you. Okay, we move on to item 5, and that's Swansea Council's volunteering strategy development. Is it Anthony or Amy? Amy.
I'm just going to introduce it actually, if that's okay. So
fine.
yeah, just the volunteering strategy development, you've got 2 documents there, an integrated impact assessment, a screening document, and then a report that gives it's information only and outlining the progress of developing the strategy so far. And I'm going to hand over to Anthony, who's going to summarise that. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I'm just going to summarise briefly the report. So this is the development of this Swansea Council volunteering strategy is work that's come out of the community response work stream of the council's Achieving Better Together transformation plan, and it's about developing a strategy and an accompanying policy for hosted volunteering opportunities within Swansea Council. The report outlines an initial mapping of existing volunteering opportunities within the council, focused within cultural services and adult social services. Excuse me. And we found that there's various service-specific approaches that are being taken within the policies and procedures specific to those services. Some good practice identified. A working group of officers has been established with a number of workshops held to date, and I have to acknowledge Julia Manser is with us online today, so working very much in partnership and being supported by SCVS on this piece of work. Yeah, so a number of workshops have been held to date, sharing different processes to volunteering, identifying good practice, and what would be required to form a strategy and policy to support quality volunteering opportunities within the authority and a consistent approach. So the working group met very recently, and we're currently making plans to include the voice of volunteers and potential future volunteers in this process. I don't know if Julia does want to come in and make comment on the work from the regional perspective, but that's just a brief overview of the full information report of where we are.
Julie, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks very much to Amy and to Anthony, and in fact to the officer working group, which is an indication, I think, of the enthusiasm within Swansea Council for improving the volunteering offer. When I butted in earlier and introduced myself over another colleague there, Julie, I did introduce myself as both SCVS and West Glamorgan Regional Partnership, and on secondment at West Glamorgan Regional Partnership as the volunteer project manager. I've been able to work with Anthony's team, and one of the things that Swansea Council have undertaken with it was a 3-hour volunteering development workshop and also assessment workshop, which looked really at the strengths and weaknesses that Swansea Council may have with their volunteering offer, and in fact links in quite lovely with Dave's presentation on workforce development as well. And there were lots of points made in an action plan which looked at things that Swansea Council will do in the short term. But I think what Anthony and the officer working group are doing is kind of co-producing a strategy which will be the medium, really, and long term for Swansea Council. And there is a huge commitment within the officer working group to improve things and move towards a consistent approach for managing and recruiting volunteers. As Anthony alluded to, there is some differences in approach, but hopefully this work stream will iron some of that out.
Thank you, Julie. Oh.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I forgot the point I was going to add then, actually, sorry. Yeah, I mean, so your work, Julia, strong part of the working group with the officers, and as you said, there we are about to kind of embark on a co-production. So bringing in those voices really important, that those with experience of volunteering with us, and those that would like that opportunity have the opportunity at an early stage. So that's where we are currently with it, and plans are moving ahead to start that process.
Can I just ask, is there an age thing where you get problems with volunteers? Because you seem to, wherever I've been involved, it's always the older people that seem to volunteer, not the youngsters, because they're having to work and haven't got the time to volunteer. So is there difficulty in recruiting, is what I'm asking, in certain age groups?
I'll go. I think, well, I'm sure that Julia will have comment now, but I think what we've found across the different services where there are those volunteering opportunities, depending on the service, depending on the opportunity, depending on the benefit for the volunteer, that there's a whole range of interest.
If I may add to that, Chair, there does seem some research now which is actually sort of counterintuitive, but showing that if you want something doing, you ask a busy person, and that there is a lot of volunteering being undertaken by the mid-age range of sort of those 40. But there is, and I know we don't read it on Wales Online, but there is a huge appetite from young people to be involved in the community and to develop work readiness skills. And so actually the challenge, I think, is engaging that audience. And there are a number of roles that would be appropriate for younger people to undertake. Obviously, perhaps not those under 18 necessarily within the care sector, but there's certain ways that we can engage younger people. And I think if we don't do that, then of course the future will be a bleaker place. And in terms of workforce development, we'll miss a trick there as well. But there are a lot of people across the board that are volunteering. It's just finding that hook, finding the right support to get everybody involved. And of course, when the community responds and adds into services, I think we find ourselves in a much better place.
That's great. That's great to know. Thank you, Julie. Welcome.
Yeah, and I was just going to bring in about the next steps. So as mentioned, the strategy is going to be, or the policy in the strategy is going to be co-produced with the voices of volunteers, the staff who've had experience of working with volunteers, and where we want to promote it more. So that will come back to this committee as well, a draft version of that for your consideration as well.
I'm happy to go second. I went first last time.
Yeah, I put this thing on, isn't it? It's a fairly simple sort of a question. With volunteering, is it just confined to charities, or where can they actually volunteer in terms of well, improving their own either their skills or their academic skills?
Can I come in just on, so the policy we're talking about now is about volunteering within the council as an organisation. So that's the policy we're bringing through this committee. But I think generally volunteering is obviously across many different organisations. And I would refer to Julia actually to come in on this, because I think as your role as a volunteer development officer, it's, yeah. But just what we're talking about here with the strategy is us as an organisation.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. Yes, Councillor, I just wanted to underline what Amy has said there, that what we're talking about here is the thousands of volunteering opportunities that are available under the wing of Swansea Council. But you're quite right, obviously the voluntary sector is where we consider the lion's share of volunteering to take place. But my role in Swansea Volunteer Centre with SCVS is so many people come forward to me asking specifically for volunteering experience within Swansea Council. And coming back to Dave's sort of presentation there, I think that's because they hold ambitions to work within our council, and so are looking for a direct experience. But within our council there are a range of volunteering opportunities, varied. So things like community centres, obviously, as you will know, Councillor, are run purely by volunteers. There are volunteering roles within adult services, within day centres. There are so many things within libraries, supporting young people. There's actually probably a volunteering opportunity within the council for everybody.
Councillor Fogarty, sorry.
Thank you. So I've got a few questions. Sorry, I hope that's okay. I think, so first of all, I'm really pleased to be on this committee, partly because of this work. I know it started prior to the election, so I'm coming to this sort of fresh halfway through, I suppose. But what I would really like to see a little bit more of, perhaps when the policy comes back to committee, is just reiteration of what the aims of the strategy are, because volunteering achieves so much, so many different things. And what is it that we're trying to really get out of it as Swansea Council? I mean, is it about improving the experience of existing volunteers, making that more consistent? Is it about expanding volunteering opportunities? Is it about supporting the council's delivery? And I don't just mean that in terms of capacity, but also quality. We know that when you're working alongside people who have experience of using your services, generally speaking, the services you provide improve. So it could be all of those things. Julia's nodding her head, but I just want to see that really articulated so that we're reminded of it. I am a little bit surprised, with my background having worked for City of Sanctuary, to see the both race, including refugees, and asylum seekers in the integrated impact assessment in the low impact category. We know that volunteering for asylum seekers in particular who don't have the right to work can be an absolute lifeline. So I would challenge that actually. I would want to see that in at least the medium category. And then my last question, and this really is just an open question, there's no right or wrong answer. I just want to know what the thinking is around time credits at the moment, and whether that is still in vogue, and whether it's something that we're considering for volunteers with Swansea Council. Thank you.
Anthony, do you want to go first, or shall I?
I'll go first, Julia, but thanks. I'm sure you can come in and add to my response there. Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, in terms of the aims, yeah, that's a really key part of the strategy, and the co-production process will help inform that. But I would fully expect to see all of those things that you mentioned kind of come through in terms of the aims there, particularly for us, for an organisation, and for the volunteers and their experience themselves. The IIA, still plenty more work to do on that. That's an initial screening. Absolutely expect that there will be some adjustment. We are about to start the co-production process. That again will inform the integrated impact assessment process as we get into the work of doing the full impact assessment. So we'll be looking to engage with a whole range of different people to fully explore the opportunities and the impact, and make sure that everyone has access to those opportunities. Time credits, I'm going to hand over to Julia to make a response on that one. I think Julia probably would be in a better position than myself to respond to that.
Probably answer backwards, if I may, Chair. Thank you, Councillor, for your extremely pertinent questions. To answer the time credits, I would say quite categorically is no. The reasoning being links to your point in the impact assessment about those seeking sanctuary. And I know Councillor does know that time credits are actually a problem and are not able to be drawn down by volunteers that are seeking sanctuary, so those that are asylum seekers, because of Home Office regulations. So to avoid a two-tier system where some get time credits and some don't, I would absolutely say my recommendation would be that time credits aren't used. Also, in line with Welsh Government volunteering policy definition of volunteering, it's quite clear that volunteering mustn't be for financial gain, and some of the time credits are very similar to a financial gain, which is why the Home Office doesn't allow those seeking sanctuary. So my apologies for taking this backwards, but in terms of your first question about what will the scope or the of the policy and strategy be, I would suggest that probably, whilst there is a co-productive journey, so the answer will become clear, and that it's probably best to get our house in order currently and to work on a consistent set of circumstances for volunteers who are under Swansea Council, so that being, you know, a consistent approach to reimbursement of expenses, a consistent approach to training, a consistent approach to safeguarding, a consistent approach to staff who manage volunteers. But also, I think whilst consistency is important, I think ambition certainly is secondary. So I would also hope that the development of services and the experience of those using our services is something that we work with volunteers to achieve.
Thank you, Julie. Does that answer your questions, Rebecca?
Very much so. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Or Leslie?
Yeah, just sort of picking up on what Rebecca's just said about, I think one of the important things is that we need to make sure we've got a mechanism for logging the experiences and knowledge and any accreditation gained. And again, you're quite right, Julia, that this has got to be consistent. It's got to be something that we all do exactly the same across the whole council, because that presumably for some volunteers, they will be people who are eventually going to be looking for paid work. So the more that they've got to show on their CV of what they've been, they've acquired, knowledge, etc., the more useful that will be for them in the future. Thanks.
Okay, Amy or Anthony, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, yeah, we agree. Yeah, absolutely. It'll be a part of it. Yeah.
Is that the end of your report? Sorry. Sorry,
I was just going to add an extra point, if I may, Chair.
Absolutely, carry on.
Thanks to Councillor Walton for that. Yeah, I mean, data collection is important in terms of making a note of hours that have been volunteered and experiences that have been undertaken, particularly because it links to gaining references from Swansea Council and therefore does help people to achieve a career with perhaps Swansea Council themselves. So is part of, I guess, both workforce development and the tackling poverty agenda. So I'd be very keen for those hours to be logged.
Thank you. Is that the end of your report, Anthony? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much anyway for the presentation, both of you. Moving on to item 6, which is the draft corporate personal debt recovery policy. Not sure who's taking this. Is it? Did you, Amy?
Yeah. It's similar again, if that's okay. So this is the corporate personal debt recovery policy. So this is a policy which is being brought forward to you as a draft now. So we're a bit further forward with this compared to the last agenda item. So what we're aiming to get to is having a policy that we adopt as an organisation in terms of our corporate approach to the management of personal debt. So debt that individuals owe the council for various reasons it highlights in the report. And what we're asking today is for you to consider this and make any recommendations, and with the aspiration that after this meeting we will take this through corporate management team, full IAA process, the integrated impact assessment. There's just a screening attached at the moment, further consultation, and before getting signed off. So this is the beginning of the process of sign off. So there is the report, the draft policy and the IAA included, and I'll just hand over to Anthony to take you through where we are with the policy.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Chair. So this report, this report takes forward the work undertaken by the previous Tackling Poverty Policy Development Committee to start this work to draft a corporate personal debt recovery policy. I should point out that services across the authority that are involved in collecting debts are already focusing on supporting people. That's the way that we work, and this policy will support that approach and further communicate that commitment to our residents in Swansea, hopefully. So the draft policy sets out how council services will work with residents to collect personal debt and what we will do to help those who owe the council money. The policy covers personal debt owed to the council, debt being defined as any amount owed that has not been paid by the due date. The policy very much recognises that early engagement from those at risk of debt or in debt can prevent debts from escalating further, reduce indebtedness and increase the ability of residents to meet their financial responsibility. The policy recognises that the policy also recognises that a significant proportion of council services are funded through taxes and service charges, and that if income is not collected effectively, then the authority will be unable to properly fund vital services for Swansea residents. So the cost then would fall to others to pay more to make up that shortfall. But this policy is about saying that, you know, we know that anyone can experience financial difficulties at any time, and that money problems impact not just the person that's in debt, but they have an impact on families and communities. And families and communities thrive when people can afford healthy lives, a healthy standard of living, and they avoid the stresses of having money worries. So this policy will let our residents know that we will help people with money worries to get the specialist, free and impartial help if they want it. That's a really brief overview of what the report is covering and the policy itself.
And so questions? Councillor Orton.
Just checking, can you remind me that I've got a copy of the draft that we had from ages ago, and it was going to include two separate points on housing rents and council tax, and I've got to be honest, I can't remember what exactly that was, and I can't quite work out how that's now been subsumed into the actual policy, because those two items have gone completely.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, so earlier drafts, we were looking at, so we engaged with a number of services across the authority that are involved in collecting outstanding debts from residents in the work to develop this draft. You know, a number of conversations, processes, and we did initially have kind of content in the draft from some of those services, kind of outlining how those principles of the draft policy that we see in front of us are applied within their services. But the draft as it stands, we felt was kind of cleaner and simpler and really focuses on those principles without going into necessarily details for each service within the authority.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense, because I suppose each department might want to develop their own strategy for carrying out the policy. So yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Anybody else? No. Councillor Fogarty.
I'm just wondering, following on from that, how we will know, how we will have a standard then that the policy is being implemented, if it's being implemented differently across the council.
It is about setting, it's giving a clear message that as an authority, services within the authority, if people are struggling, if they foresee a money worry, then we are here to help. So it sets a standard for services, a commitment of, and like I say, you know, services across the authority in most cases have good practice. We're already doing this, but this sets that commitment to residents of Swansea, saying that, you know, we are here, we can help. Certainly, if quite often people will know that they are going to experience money worries earlier than we might as services. So we really want people to come forward and know that we are here to help. So in terms of setting a standard, I think the first point is around setting that standard, that communication, that standard that we are here to help, and ensuring that all services are meeting that, you know, that commitment that the policy is setting out.
Can I come in as well? So I think we've committed in the draft policy, or all the different departments who've contributed to this, is around annually monitoring this. But I think it's around that we can build in more, I'm sure, but based on that information. So what does good look like? You know, so how we can see that it's performing to the level that we want. So I think certainly in section 4 of the policy, when we take this to the next stage of consultation, I think we can build in there some further detail.
Just very briefly, I think that will be really important, because I'm conscious that there will be some people who, if they're falling into debt on one area and they don't want to have a different experience just because different parts of the council are doing it differently. So I think that monitoring point is really key.
Okay, thank you both. I'm just saying I welcome this is because I think a lot of people have got into debt over the last couple of years through no fault of their own, through losing jobs, through the pandemic, through anything. And I think the first instinct is to bury your head in the sand and hope it'll go away, and that doesn't happen. So, you know, you need to face the consequence, you know, you need to face the difficulties and deal with people, and people are there to help. And hopefully this is a really good policy, and hopefully it'll get taken up by a lot of people that need our help at the end of the day. So it's brilliant work. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
No, just that if you're content with this, then we're going to move forward to take this through the next signing off and consultation processes. Then.
The recommendation is that it's considered the draft corporate personal debt recovery and making any recommendations prior to progressing to the corporate management team. So if anybody's got any ideas or anything to come forward, yeah, we contact you. Yes.
And we'll incorporate what has been said from this meeting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you both. Okay. Oh, sorry, of course it is. October is the new local area coordination best practice policy, the guide including recruitment. So everybody happy with that? Hayley, did you want to make any comment on that? Or
no, not really. I think we've done some sort of foundation work just to try and make a consistent approach. And all councillors should have heard from the local area coordinators and started to arrange those regular meetups. But no, that was just to feed into the work that's going to be undertaken by the committee, really.
Okay, thank you very much, Hayley. Needed to be added to it, Alison? Is that just the one item, or
unless you want to add anything, what you're going to look at in November? Is anything on the
is anything anybody wants to bring forward?
Julie,
any issues? Sorry, Amy, pushing the back. We're passing it back onto you.
We can certainly, I was going to say, we can bring some progress on the volunteering as well. So we can, you know, certainly on that we'd have an update.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I think we probably need a bit more discussion about, you had a context setting around workforce. You need to narrow down as a committee what particularly are you going to focus on, and once we've worked out what we're particularly going to focus on as a committee, we can then work, well, where does that fit into a timescale? At some point, Welsh Government initiatives are going to, you know, they're going to develop, the committee are going to want to consider those and see whether how it fits with, or how the council is going to fit in with that. But I'm guessing that's going to be, you know, the earliest, that's probably going to be March and April. Even if that, you probably need to do something in advance of that, maybe around the area of, yeah, but how do we stabilise for the time being? But probably a further discussion to nail that down a bit and then add that to the work programme, Chair.
Okay, there's no other comments or questions. That's the end of the meeting. Thank you all for being kind to me in my first chairing, and safe journey home. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.